Hello, hello. How is everyone? Am I audible? Can you all hear me?
Yep.
All right. Just checking, is team proposition here in entirety?
We're missing one of our speakers. She's like on her way to the
Hmm.
call, so is it possible to like wait for a few minutes?
Yeah, that's okay. You can just write your speaker order in the chat in the meantime.
Okay, thanks.
Also, I'm just confirming if the other two judges on the panel are here yet. If you are, can you please speak up?
Yep, on the here.
Triangle. And do we also have no. Isolda? Are you there? Just a note, we're gonna wait a couple of minutes. I think one judge is still not here yet. I've texted in the Discord, so let's wait a couple of minutes.
So sorry, my internet was really bad, so I couldn't join Zoom, but I'm here now.
That's okay. That's noted. We're just waiting on a panelist.
there's been an increase in the right. People feel less engaged with the political system. They feel that they are not winning as a part of left-wing parties because they have stopped trying to win because the right wing is constantly clearing out ahead of them in elections. First, we think that political institutions are just going to be
Point of information.
too ineffective. You think that political institutions
Yeah, hello guys. There's going to be a slight delay. They're gonna replace the judge in this room, the panel in this room. So thank you for your patience. Let's wait a few more minutes. All right, just checking again. Are both the panelists here?
I'm here.
All right. So Jawad is here. Anga is here as well. All right. I believe the panel is now complete. Replacement is sorted. So let's officially start. Hello, everyone. My name is Ali. I'll be the chair for this round. Along me are two other wonderful judges. If you'd like to introduce yourselves, please.
Hi everyone, Anga here. I think it's your panel. Best of luck.
Hi, Jawad here. I'll be the panelist.
All right, amazing. Can one of the panelists share a timer, please? I don't think I'm able to. I can still send timestamps in the chat. But if not, then I can just send timestamps. Anyways, do we have proposition and oppositions order? Yes, we do. Welcome to the octofinals of Oxford WSDC. We're very happy you're here. Without further ado, can we please have proposition one? Remember to please state your gender preferences and pronouns and PR preferences. Here, good luck. Proposition one.
Hi, just to check if I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible to me.
Okay. Is it okay if I keep my camera off because I'm using browser and like I can't open my camera?
All good with me.
Okay. Pronouns she, her, and POIs verbally. Barack Obama's '08 campaign became one of the most successful progressive campaigns in modern history because it convinced millions that political institutions could still work for ordinary people. Two very simple arguments. First, on how we create broader coalitions and why this is necessary for progressive change. And secondly, how we create a better political environment overall. Before that, 2 points of setup. First, what does optimistic messaging look like? I think it mainly focuses on producing meaningful reform through encouraging people to vote and to advocate for change, i.e., noting that healthcare is broken, but saying that together we can still save it. This looks like Obama saying that everyone should come together, regardless of their party affiliation. Second, what does cynical messaging look like? I think A, it emphasizes that the establishment and political institutions are fundamentally corrupt and incapable of meaningful reform, i.e., saying that elections are a scam and the only way to solve is to erase the entire system. B, the focus of this messaging is often overwhelmingly on the problems instead of the solutions proposed. It's very difficult for voters to believe that the system is horrible. Once they buy this, then they will most likely vote for you anyway because you sold them the problem. This is why anti-establishment parties are mostly centered around how the country is broken and how the country is like extremely corrupt and how the country is beyond repair. First argument then. How do we mobilize moderate voters, and how is it necessary how we create a broader coalition? The premise is very simple. Many moderate voters currently already acknowledge that the problems existent in society are genuine problems. They do not vote or don't have a party affiliation because they think neither party can focus on solving these problems. Three methods on how we solve them. Firstly, optimistic messaging reassures moderate and undecided voters that progressive change is indeed achievable. I think A, most voters are risk averse. Even when people desire change, they generally prefer reforms that appear predictable and manageable, compared to reforms that probably seem to be very risky and undermine the legitimacy of the entire political system because you have to change it a lot. But B, when left-wing politicians stress that democracy is indeed broken, it seems very contradictory to them themselves because they themselves are proposing solutions within existing frameworks. Therefore, even voters who agree with left-wing values would ultimately choose more moderate parties because more moderate parties who they perceive as safer, more transparent, and or more competent. But see, most citizens already, as we said, experience the failures of the political system in their daily lives. They do not need politicians who convince them that housing is expensive or like healthcare is inaccessible. They only need evidence that someone has a credible plan to improve these conditions in a very short future. If you portray every institution as corrupt, there's little reason to believe that policy proposals can realistically be implemented in a very short period of time and in a very short future. But D, even individuals who criticize politicians still have faith in like broader democratic principles like elections and constitutions. These institutions are entrenched through generations and through centuries and are also part of the national culture and identity. When you portray these institutions as illegitimate, many ordinary people interpret that rhetoric as an attack upon values that they themselves so cherish. Under our side of the house, politicians acknowledge that these problems exist, but they don't abandon the current system. This makes their message far more accessible to people who desire reform without desiring political upheaval entirely. Second mechanism, which is on political advocacy. We'd argue that one of the greatest barriers to political participation is not you being lazy or you being ignorant, but the belief that the participation is ultimately pointless, because every form of civic participation requires people to sacrifice time and energy. People spend weekends donating money and attending meetings after work when they could have spent that time with their family and friends. I think people are only willing to incur these costs when they believe that there is a realistic possibility that their contributions can indeed influence the outcomes at the end of the day. Optimistic messaging reinforces this belief because it tells people that even though change can be difficult, collective participation generally has the power to improve society. On the other side of the house, even if people continue agreeing with progressive values, they become less willing to invest their own resources because the expected return on that investment is more negligible. But B, this creates a dangerous feedback loop. Lower participation makes electoral victories less likely because it is very hard for you to get a bigger voter base, which then appears to confirm the cynical narrative on the right wing that democratic politics never works in the end. But lastly, why is this layer important? This is important because progressive reforms almost always depend upon expanding participation among groups that have historically been politically marginalized, i.e., lower income voters or ethnic minorities. These groups have already faced greater barriers to political engagement because of work obligations and financial constraints. If left-wing politicians themselves reinforce the belief that participation cannot change anything, these already fragile forms of political participation it becomes even harder to sustain. Third layer to this argument then, I'd argue that left-wing politicians typically campaign on reforms such as universal healthcare or stronger public education or labor protection. Note that these are all campaign issues depending on functioning institutions and the capacity of the state. A state that is crippling with corruption and has flawed institutions simply cannot build strong welfare systems. If left-wing politicians increasingly stress that institutions are fundamentally broken and politics don't work, then voters are likely to infer that even if I like left-wing policies like climate change, they cannot be implemented successfully. What is the end effect of this argument? First, moderates are the most important group in this debate. We'd argue that the most extreme conservatives or liberals who are deeply attached to the movement are unlikely to change on both sides because they will support the party regardless of its messaging. I'll take it at the end of this argument. So it does that this debate occurs at the moderates. But two, by capturing moderates, left-wingers are able to win over the majority of the voter bloc and pass reforms. Policies that protect abortion rights could protect the agency of millions of expecting mothers who may not be in a financially stable position to have a child. Policies that pursue further action against climate change can help prevent deforestation and rising water levels that displace millions of vulnerable communities. Before that, sure.
What are examples of reform that will likely occur under optimistic and hopeful messaging in your side?
For example, voting and advocating for more change to address the problems with healthcare, for example, in the US. For example, Obama's campaign on everyone voting and everyone having a voice in the political communities to advocate for what they want and to change in the political system. Second argument, how do you create a more productive political environment? I want to first note how it is very likely that the right-wing politicians are motivated by the focus on solution-based messaging from left-wing parties on our side of the house. I think one, elections are very close. Politicians want to grasp every vote that they possibly can. Right-wing politicians want to win over those voters who believe in more solution-based messaging. Two, when one party is focusing on solutions, it looks very bad in terms of optics if another party keeps on saying the problems are too big to solve. Left-wing parties can utilize the lack of solution-based messaging and attack right-wing parties. Thus, right-wing parties are probably more forced to comply to some extent. This makes politics generally more productive because, firstly, political parties focus more on polishing solutions during campaigning. They see it as their means to success. The solutions will probably be more thorough and well thought out. But two, politicians are more solution-oriented. They understand that voters voted for them because of solutions that they propose. They are more likely to focus on delivering policies and changes and more willing to accept compromises for successful negotiations. But lastly, even if right-wing politics do not adapt more optimistic messaging, we still improve the political system because we prevent emotional rhetoric from being able to justify bad left-wing policies. Because a lot of times, bad policies are passed because it sounds emotionally powerful. If political messaging is more optimistic, politicians basically have to assume that a system can work and that change is actually possible within. That changes how left-wingers justify their policies. So instead of saying things like this doesn't work because the system is too broken or institutions failed, so nothing can be done, they're forced to actually explain their ideas properly, especially when things go wrong. This means we're probably going to get better policy implemented in the first place. Left-wingers are going to face so much of a backlash if people believe their policies are bad because they're bad rather than because the system is screwed permanently. As left-wingers will tell voters on their side of the house. On the other side of the house, you have more accountability because you're able to explain to voters how you actually conduct these policies because voters are more confident in you trying to change the system. Thus, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Proposition 1, for that fine speech. Can we please have Opposition 1?
Am I both audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
All right, great. Just give me like 30 seconds to set up. Okay. Start my speech. Let me just start my timer. Start in 3, 2, 1. There are three things that I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, some responses to the previous speaker. And finally, our constructives on side opposition. Firstly, on setup. The first thing I want to do here is provide a very clear stance from side opposition, which is to say the left-wing candidates should not primarily sell voters a hopeful story about how the political system is capable of fixing itself. We would much rather send a pessimistic message that the current political system is structurally captured by wealth, corporations, media elites, entrenched institutions, and that meaningful change requires confrontation with these problems. But also note, panel, that this is not a nihilism debate. Our world will not tell people that nothing will ever improve either on our side. We will tell people that the system is broken and it will only be changed if ordinary people stop trusting the promises of the elite and instead mobilize for change. We will be pessimistic and cynical about the ways in which politicians try to flip reality and not be truthful about how bad the status quo truly is, and often as a result of their lack of action or corruption. The problem right now is that voters feel that politics does not work for them. They feel that rising costs, stagnant waging, housing insecurity, climate inaction, lobbying, corruption, which means that it currently exists, which means that sending optimistic and hopeful messaging simply does nothing when they experience a problem firsthand. But moving on to then the second piece of setup, which is what does the status quo truly look like? And we will tell you that in the status quo, there is a dramatic rise of conservative and right-wing politics. How is this true? You can look at like the US, where you see Trump making unilateral decisions without approval from Congress, and you actively see the Supreme Court justifying Trump's calls. You also look like many European countries where far-right politics is actively increasing in countries like France, Germany, and Italy. But why is this systemically true? We think there are four structural reasons as to why right-wing politics is becoming more and more influential. Firstly, we think that there's a general movement towards anti-wokeism and anti-leftist narratives. Secondly, there's a failure and collapse of identity politics. Thirdly, many governments are trending towards fiscally protective and conservative policies to protect their own economies, for example, through tariffs. And fourthly, recent immigration waves around the world result in things like fear-mongering and anti-immigration sentiments, which are actively weaponized by right-wing politics to support their own agendas. For all these reasons, we think that right-wing politics is currently on the rise around the world. Then with that being said, before I go into our constructives, I'll provide two responses to the previous speaker. The first being on their claim on what the cynical messaging actually look like. Because PM tells you that it looks like acknowledging the problem exists. But there are two responses here. Firstly, this is extremely vague. What does acknowledging the problem actually mean? Because we will tell you that under their world, the problem that gets acknowledged are not going to be the structural reasons for why these people's suffering exists. Rather, the blame is going to be shifted to like certain politics, like certain politicians who might just be bad, who might just be individually bad, but they aren't actually going to target the root cause of the suffering. But B, also note that they claim that cynical discussions are disillusioning and it creates things like apathy, but we would actually flip this, and I'm going to elaborate this in my argument as to prove why ultimately, because cynical messaging identifies and provides an explanation to most people, it's something that people can actively relate to and therefore are more likely going to support left-wing politics on our side exclusively. Moving on then to the first argument, which is that cynical messaging preserves the left's ability to fundamentally transform society rather than merely administer the status quo. The purpose of left-wing politics is not to simply elect left-wing politicians, but to redistribute the political and economic power away from entrenched elites and more towards ordinary people. We care about reducing inequality, strengthening labor rights, and expanding public services, limiting corporate influence, and addressing structural discrimination. All these goals require society to believe that the current political system is not merely imperfect, but that it systematically produces injustice, which we do exclusively through cynical messaging. There are three layers to this argument. Firstly, structural reform is only justified if people believe that the political existing political system is structurally flawed. The biggest reforms ask society to fundamentally rethink how power is distributed. Universal healthcare requires people to believe that private healthcare markets consistently fail ordinary citizens. Strong labor protections require people to believe that employers possess disproportionate bargaining power. Campaign finance reforms require people to believe that wealthy individuals have captured democratic institutions. All this to say is that these reforms all begin from the same premise, that the system itself is responsible for producing injustice. If left-wing candidates instead spend their campaigns reassuring voters that the political system fundamentally works and simply needs better leadership, they undermine the very justification for the reforms they hope to implement. Voters naturally conclude that institutions are basically functioning, then only modest adjustments are necessary. Radical redistribution on our side or institutional redesign suddenly appears excessive because candidates themselves have claimed that the problem is oftentimes can be easily fixed through their world when it is done through hopeful and optimistic messaging. This matters because political messaging does not merely determine who wins elections, it shapes what kind of policies the electorate believes are legitimate after the election, as well as what type of policies are likely going to get passed by the general public. The second layer of this argument is that optimistic messaging gradually transforms left-wing politics into managerial politics rather than transformative politics. When candidates consistently tell voters that democracy is fundamentally healthy and institutions are largely working as intended, then failures are understood as the product of temporary incompetence or unusually bad politicians. This is what I was saying earlier in my response to the previous speaker, which is that it's not enough for the prime minister to come up and say that they also acknowledge that problems exist insofar as these problems aren't actually reflective of why the suffering exists in the status quo. Over time, then, on their world, left-wing parties increasingly resemble centrist liberal parties because they no longer campaign on the premise that institutions themselves require transformation. The ideological distinction between the left and the political center gradually disappears, and this is uniquely harmful on proposition because the comparative advantage that the left-wing party brings has always been its willingness to question entrenched structures of power rather than merely operate within them. The third layer of this argument, then, is that campaign narratives create governing mandates. If candidates spend months telling voters that democratic institutions fundamentally work, then every future compromise can be justified by appealing to those same institutions. Politicians can argue that courts must be respected, that legislative procedures cannot be challenged, that corporate interests must be accommodated to. By contrast, cynical messaging creates an entirely different democratic mandate. If candidates repeatedly explain that institutions have been captured by concentrated wealth, lobbying, or entrenched interests, then voters expect confrontation rather than accommodation, which is why on our side, politicians are held more accountable to actively see real change when it comes to governing mandates themselves. Moving on then to the second argument, which is that cynical messaging that public anger, no thank you, is directed towards the real sources of injustice rather than being captured by reactionary movements. The first layer of this argument is that people naturally search for explanations when they experience persistent hardship, which both teams of this debate agree hardship currently exists in the status quo. Across many democracies, people increasingly experience daily economic insecurity, declining purchasing power, rising housing costs, and other issues. Very few citizens respond to these experiences by concluding that nothing caused them. Human beings naturally want to seek for an explanation as to why the current conditions around them exist, and they're trying to seek an explanation. The debate is therefore never between anger and no anger. That anger already exists. The question then is who is able to make sense of this anger in a way that is useful and actively reasonable to the general public. When left-wing candidates openly argue that democratic institutions have become distorted by concentrated wealth, lobbying, corporate influence, and entrenched elites, they provide voters with a coherent structural explanation as to why these problems persist. Side. Then what is the comparative? It's out of order. Optimistic messaging under their rule leaves an explanatory vacuum that other political movements inevitably fill, which is to say the proposition assumes that if left-wing candidates refuse to criticize political institutions too strongly, then public trust will simply recover. But people who continue struggling economically while repeatedly hearing politicians defend the very institutions that allow these problems to exist experience an obvious contradiction between what they're told and what they observe in their own lives. This is actively problematic and dangerous under their rule because this creates enormous opportunities for reactionary movements. Rather than blaming structural inequalities or concentrations of wealth, they redirect public anger towards immigrants, minority communities, which we believe allows other reactionary movements, namely right-wing parties, to actively become stronger, which we believe is harmful because that prevents the redistribution of resources and it prevents the protection of the most vulnerable. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition 1, for that fine speech. Can we please have Proposition 2?
All right. I won't be turning on my camera because my internet is quite bad. Please give me verbal POIs as well. We cannot build a better tomorrow with a hammer that only breaks things down. We're so proud to propose. The first thing I want to note here is that opposition's stance is that pessimistic messaging means framing current political system is captured by elites and wealth. Opposition wants to escape the true burden they have to defend by saying that their side doesn't need to defend telling people the system is broken. But that solution is possible if people lobby together. One, they can't simultaneously claim that they will frame the current political system is captured by elites and wealth, and then expect that people will genuinely believe change is possible when they tell them that we can overthrow the corrupt institutions that we lobby together. If you tell people it's captured by elites and wealth, they won't believe change is possible at all because they believe that all possible reforms can be overthrown by the class that holds disproportionate power. They think that they can never actually do anything about the current system and therefore become hopeless. The second thing, and I want to note something important here, is that since left-wing politicians are focusing on solutions on our side, they implicitly must mention the problem too, because the problem is needed for a solution to exist in the first place. But on their side, if they focus on problems so much, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to focus on solutions. So they can't just assert that they have both on their sides. All right. So, first clarification at the top of my speech. Then we think that we will probably also acknowledge the core problems, right? For example, how you see Zohran Mamdani, not blaming it on specific politicians as they say, but instead going directly against the biggest corporate powers. For example, not taking investment from the biggest corporate funds and getting all of his campaign money from the grassroots people, from donations, etc. And he has been very, very successful with his hope rhetoric. He points out the systematic issues within New York is the affordability crisis, and then gives actual policy changes and actual policy suggestions that can solve this problem. We think that this is a much more effective solution on our side of the house. Why do we think that people will acknowledge the core problems instead of what they say, that you will just blame it on specific politicians? The reason for this is that when you use a cynical message that blames individual corrupt politicians, you are playing a game of whack-a-mole. If you focus on candidate X is corrupt, the moment candidate X is voted out, voters think the problem is solved. That means that you literally have no leverage to get elected again, right? People will think that the bad politician is already gone, so there's literally no problem in the status quo right now. So if people want to keep their job, obviously they have to say that there's something wrong within the system and identify that correctly. And it must be something that people resonate with for them to be reelected again. They tell you that the prerequisite to transforming society is if people recognize that the society is systemically bad right now. Firstly, people already know society has problems right now because social media and modern news already perpetrate pessimistic news about the world, since these are the most shocking and most sensational things that can get the most views and likes. There's already an oversaturation of pessimistic rhetoric. For example, as they say themselves, how you get right-wing populism that identifies the core problems within the political system. There's also just people and your co-workers and your friends and family around you complaining about the system. So you probably already know that there's problems within the status quo that is within a system that must be changed. Since there's already an oversaturation of pessimistic rhetoric, left-wingers can never stand out through giving more pessimistic rhetoric. We think that the only way they can stand out is by having a new perspective, which is much more hopeful and optimistic. The second thing here is that on proposition side, left-wing politicians also acknowledge that problems exist, since the prerequisite to seem optimistic by listing policy solutions is literally by acknowledging that there's a problem that needs to be solved in the first place. For example, as I said, Zohran Mamdani, the difference here is that we offer solutions which makes a better future seem much more tangible, because you literally give them specific ways to solve the current problem. They will think that, oh, this is something that we can achieve. Unlike on their side of the house, when you say that, oh, corporate power is so powerful, it literally controls campaigns right now. It literally controls who are the candidates that wins in elections. People think that there's literally no way, there's no agency for them to solve that problem, which makes them far more hopeless on their side of the house. Also, only showing that you are relatable and relate to these problems and acknowledging that these problems exist gives voters zero material utility. So we don't think that people will buy in on their side of the house. The third thing here is that optimistic messaging makes governing substantially easier after winning office, right? So even if you buy that people will buy in to the left-wing rhetoric about how we can solve all these systemic issues. For example, like we can all overthrow like the capitalistic world right now that is like rigging everything. Then the problem with this is that this is not simply what left-wing politicians can achieve in a single term, right? So after like they fail to do anything
Why?
substantial in their term, that just makes left-wing politicians seem even less unpopular and even more unpopular, and make even less people vote for them. The reason for this is that when politicians spend years arguing that the political system is incapable of producing justice, they create unrealistic expectations among their own supporters. Voters feel like meaningful change requires sweeping transformation because ordinary processes have supposedly failed. The reality, however, is that legislation requires compromise and reforms take years to implement. Optimistic messaging prepares supporters for this reality. Democratic institutions are inherently slow. Legislation rarely passes. There's filibusters and all those other barriers of democratic governance. Supporters who have been told throughout the campaign that democracy remains capable of gradual improvement are more willing to tolerate these delays because they understand that improvement and reform is an incremental process on our side of the house. B here is that governments need public patience to have long-term reforms. Many progressive policies produce benefits only after several election cycles. Hopeful messaging encourages voters to stay engaged throughout this process because it reinforces the belief that steady progress is worth waiting. Before I go on, sure, PY.
If it's true that telling people the actual core issue of society will scare them, on your world, what will left-wing candidates tell society is the cause of rising housing costs, inaccessible healthcare, and economic inequality?
We think that it's probably like things like the general trends right now, like geopolitical tensions, for example, that make it so that like inflation is increasing. Obviously, there's like acknowledgement of how some politicians are funded by like large PACs and do not actually like represent what the like citizens want. For example, what Zara Mamdani did in his election. I'm sure like my later speakers will also expand on that, and we think that we made that quite clear from first. All right. They say that reactionary movements, like right-wing movements, become stronger. The poor person is turned off when a left-wing candidate is seen to be defending institutions that have exploited them, but overtaxing their labor and failing to provide welfare. One, this is a very uncharitable characterization of our case. Left-wing politicians on our side are not defending institutions as simply good. We're saying that they don't exploit people. We're saying institutions are flawed, but still like the main way that change can actually happen. That is very, very different. Funding institutions and being optimistic about politics are not the same thing. You can say welfare has failed, but here's our plan to rebuild it properly. That's optimistic and critical of the institutional failure. The cynical version just says welfare has failed and the system never cared about you. The second thing here is that even if some voters feel anger or distrust, that does not mean that they move to the right. The more common response is just that it's political withdrawal, right? So that means that there's going to be more voter apathy and less voter turnout on their house because they will simply think that no one can simply represent me. The political system is completely failed. Like nothing I do when voting actually helps. Lastly, they bring out something on right-wing populism, but I would like to just point out how this would drive away core supporters. This is because left-wingers' foundational logic is different from right-wingers. Left-wingers rely on big governments to do things like protect civil rights, implement social safety nets, regulate corporations. But right wingers want a smaller government. So, like this rhetoric only applies to right wingers' foundational ideology. B here is that right wing pessimistic messaging is highly effective because it usually pairs cynicism with a system with an easy external scapegoat. For example, like immigrants, foreign nations were a shadowy cultural elite while promising a return to a nostalgic past. But left wing pessimism focuses on structural problems like corporate powers or systemic racism, but they cannot simply scapegoat this and simply solve this in a few terms. We are so proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Proposition 2, for that speech. Can we please have Opposition 2? Opposition 2, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. He and pronouns and verbal POIs. Before I dive into two areas of response in the speech, I want to engage in one piece of strategic clarification at the top. What does cynical and pessimistic messaging actually entail in this round? What Team China Gold says is that there is an overwhelming emphasis on reform being incapable. This is untrue for several reasons. And the core structural reason why is because left-wing political candidates do not have the political incentive to claim that society will never improve. Because firstly, this contradicts their political campaigns and promises of offering reform, especially towards their voter base and moderates. And secondly, because there are Democratic Party pressures on candidates against claiming that reform is not necessary because it reduces things such as increased protests and increased funding towards left-wing parties as a whole. Then they say that the messaging on our side of the house will be overwhelmingly problem-oriented. But that is not how political messaging works, because we can also focus on solutions. Political messaging is not a binary between just problems or just solutions. So here is the nuance. This is the actual difference between what the messaging on both sides looks like. Left-wing candidates in propositions world will claim and in their messaging that the current healthcare system has hope. We just need to do certain things, such as lowering certain drug costs and increasing subsidies for specific drug R&D. On the contrary, left-wing candidates in our world will not just, it isn't just that we quote unquote erase public health care, but it is analogous to the messaging of Medicare for all in the US, where Bernie Sanders and progressive Democrats such as AOC did not focus their messaging did not argue that healthcare simply needed better management from politicians, but systematically argued that the private insurance system itself as a structure profits from denying care and often is the reason why there is structural healthcare inequality. That naturally led for more progressive policies with extreme outcomes such as Medicare for all being supported by moderates as well. This is the difference between the two sides, that we can also have a problem solutions that are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent within our messaging, but it is focused on the scale of the problem and the scale of the solution that is different. Our side focuses on the scale being targeted at the structure itself, that structures need to change. On their side of the house, it is simply that the structure is fine, but people and issues within the structure need to be temporarily solved. Two areas of response in the speech then. Firstly, which side or which form of messaging is more effective? So this is whether or not people buy into this messaging in the first place. Second area of response then, independent from it being more effective, which form of messaging is generally more beneficial, assuming that both forms of messaging work. Let's first talk about the effectiveness of messaging differing on both sides. The first layer of analysis is that individuals are already experiencing hardship and therefore do not buy into this increased problem-oriented messaging from politicians. This is precisely the opposite, that individuals are already experiencing hardship, as we concede in our first argumentation. But if left-wing political candidates are not acknowledging these hardships and claiming that despite you not being employed, despite you having less welfare, despite you having less opportunities if you were a minority, despite you facing specific issues regarding immigration and your fundamental rights in the criminal justice system, we are not acknowledging this and claiming that the current systems that entrench and the current elites that entrench your hardships should be kept at the top. There's less likely to be buy-in to this messaging because this messaging loses credibility, because there's a discrepancy between the optimism of politicians, of left-wing candidates, and the lived experiences of the majority of the population. This is exactly the analysis that we give to you, that the flip, such as right-wing politicians actively capitalizing on the daily economic struggles of rural workers in the US and the fear of job displacement due to immigrants being capitalized by right-wing politicians in the UK. This is the exact type of addressing the lived experiences and hardships that is likely to be successful political messaging. But crucially, this argument was not just about the acknowledgement of the problem. As we flagged at the top, the scale of reform is also more convincing because it is about completely altering systems, such as completely altering how public welfare occurs, not just temporally increasing the amount of money that you give to homeless or, like, for instance, people that lack education in the status quo. The scale of reform is far more convincing, especially if you believe that individuals are struggling in the status quo. Then their next argumentation is that individuals lose hope. I question the asymmetry of this argument because they also claim and they try to co-opt our point on problem identification on their side of the house in P2. Because fundamentally, if left-wing candidates need to identify a source of an issue and address or specific hardships that voter bases are going through and moderates are going through, obviously there needs to be problem identification on their side of the house as well. Then the difference is in the scale of problem identification. Why does this not cause political nihilism? What we prove to you is that problems still affect individuals. It isn't just that if the Democratic Party says that these are XYZ issues in the status quo, simply people say, okay, these issues can exist, they can continue to harm my life, I'm not going to engage in further political engagement. That is absolutely untrue, because politics is still seen as the dominant space for change for the average voter base and for individuals. That is why people vote in the first place. That is why people protest in the first place. That is why people show up to things like local referendums or local city council meetings. These are different things that individuals will still believe is important for political change because it has a direct effect on their quality of life. But secondly, we want to bring back our characterization, which is that the actual status quo and nuance is not one of political nihilism conflated with this type of pessimism. That the flip is actually more true, that structural reform requires a larger political base, that the messaging of left-wing political candidates, it's not that the problem exists, it is unsolvable, but the flip, that the problem is grand in scale, that we need to dismantle entire structures and institutions, and therefore for us to be as successful as possible, we need the most amount of protests, the most amount of moderates also buying into left-wing politics. That was a type of messaging that actually led to more hope because of the fact that these ambitions led to individuals dreaming of a better tomorrow. Second area of response then, independent of which side's political messaging is more effective, which form of political messaging is more beneficial. Their response is simply that left-wing politicians are even more unpopular on our side of the house. They give you absolutely zero analysis why voters do not understand that reform is long-term. Obviously, the messaging and promises, campaign promises of politicians will naturally be long-term. Obviously, it is impossible for you to dismantle the entire wealth inequality or dismantle how the criminal justice system operates in the status quo in 5 years. Transformative politics fundamentally requires multiple political cycles. They never prove to you why voters will disengage or will be disillusioned simply because it takes a longer time. But here is the flip. If the messaging of politicians on their side of the house is overly optimistic and hopeful, but there is no direct change in their quality of life because of the fact that the types of policies that they're able to implement are marginal in scale at best, there's a contradiction between the lived experience of voter bases that had supported the left-wing politicians and their reality, which means that even if they do get some changes in the short term, it is actually far more likely that people will be fed up and disillusioned with left-wing political candidates on their side of the house. But they do not give you any response to our two mechanisms that prove to you why messaging is more beneficial. Firstly, because optimistic messaging gradually transforms left-wing politics into managerial politics on their side of the house rather than transformative politics. This is an independent point that flipped their analysis on why small-scale changes will happen on our side of the house that got no response in P2. Secondly, that campaign narratives create governing mandates from the top, and institutions can justify specific governing mandates that actually lead to broader scale change. They give you zero analysis why this is infeasible, but why even watered down versions of this cannot be possible in the long term on our side of the house. At the end of my speech, I'll also flag that they give you zero response to their political messaging being actively harmful to certain groups. That cynical messaging ensures that public anger is directed towards injustice on our side of the house. On their side of the house, it is very easy for reactionary movements to capture this type of political messaging and target the anger and inexperience of these individuals towards specific minorities that are vulnerable to these messaging, which is far more harmful in terms of justifying further policies for the people that need the most protection. On all of these grounds, clear opposition win.
All right, thank you, Opposition 2. Can we please have Proposition 3?
Hello, am I all audible and visible? Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible and
Oh,
visible.
okay.
All good here.
Thanks. Two things in this speech. First, I want to talk about which side better mobilizes voters. And then second, I want to talk about the independent path to victory on our side, on which side you actually get better policies by making political discourse seem less apathetic and less of an annoyance to the swing voters who stand in the middle. Firstly, then, on which side is better able to mobilize voters? The central claim we give is that pessimism makes people feel too hopeless and makes the institutions seem too bad for liberal change to actually happen, which by definition literally requires for the institutions to be good in the first place. The main response we get from LO and also parts of DLO is just that pessimism doesn't automatically equal nihilism. And yes, I agree with this definition. The issue, however, is with how people will interpret this messaging either way. Sure, your pessimistic messaging might not be phrased in a nihilistic way, but people and humans naturally like focusing on negativity and they like focusing on problems. Us as human beings generally recognize danger before we actually recognize any solution. This is something that's just naturally encoded in human beings in the first place. And the problem with this is that this just basically means that the most of the media attention and most of voter attention is paid to how bad things are actually getting. This means that there's less focus on the actual solution side of things. So even if they say that on their side there's a huge emphasis on the solution that just comes after recognizing the root problems, most of the time people will be and the media will be spent on debating what the root problem actually is rather than assessing the validity of a solution. The second thing we hear from them is that you actually need a root cause. The issue with a claim like this is that on our side, a root cause is still implied. Because if a solution clearly targets the limiting of something like big pharma or the limiting of private investment and private equity buying up all of housing, it's probably implied that big pharma or private equity is a core issue. It's not like people just don't know why policies are being put. If we're limiting private healthcare, then presumably that people can voters can figure out that private healthcare is a problem. The key distinction, however, is that people focus on assessing the actual solution rather than just focusing out what a bigger issue is or trying to rank issues and figure out what type of issue to mobilize people around, because this is ultimately a very unproductive type of debate, as we'll later prove. The second thing we hear from them is that cynicism makes voters expect confrontation. I think there's a number of issues with this. The first is that once again, this just seeds that most attention goes towards discussing only the issue, that people just forget that there's also a solution side of things because people are always expecting confrontation, that voters take to the streets to lobby against big and powerful groups, or voters start opposing the other sides of a political spectrum because they only focus on confrontation because that's how they are mobilized. But second of all, I think this just drives a very big us versus them mentality where the left will attack conservative institutions and attack conservative idols. This looks like people going to the street to attack in the UK, maybe attacking Nigel Farage and everything he stands for, because this is a root cause that their party, their left-wing party points out, and that people are expecting confrontation, and when they actually take to the streets or do whatever to manifest this type of confrontation, it just mobilizes retaliating anger from the other side, from the right wing. If the right wing is so prominent as they characterize now, there's presumably going to be a lot of pushback from them, which just creates a lot of unproductive discourse, and I'll later prove why this creates a lot of political deadlock and why generally a really bad thing. Not right now. I also want to just explain why pessimism and negativity is just a really bad thing for swing voters. Because swing voters are people who have a very balanced worldview. They're very moderate and they want concessions and they want things coming out from both sides. They're not looking for huge partisan conflicts. They want change that is actually going to be benefiting them. And once they hear that there is a type of change that's able to benefit them, this is in which that there's a tipping point in the messaging where they actually lean towards one side rather than lean towards the other. So on their side, have the right-wing retaliation where there's a bunch of argument and more partisan and pointless fighting. This is probably extremely bad for these swing voters, and it makes things generally feel insurmountable because problems on their side are always framed as these huge things. So no matter what solution you're able to give, the solution will always feel too little, by nature of the emphasis that you have put on identifying a root problem and blowing it up to such a big extent. So it just feels that the solution is impossible to actually address this problem in any way. But second of all, we also just generally pointed out the issue with this, I'll take you after this point. The issue with the this type of messaging on their side is just that implicitly it makes trying feel worthless, because if the left-wing reforms rely on institutions actually working, then you aren't really willing to work outside of institutions or work with broken institutions, so you just get more apathetic voters and more apathetic people who don't believe in liberalist reforms in the first place. Before I continue, I'll take a point.
Why is it a bad thing that people debate on what the root cause is on our world if problem identification is the prerequisite for an effective and feasible solution?
Number one, I already explained that problem identification is symmetrical on our side, and it's better because people aren't only focusing on the problem. But number two, I think when it comes to problem identification, this is what the right wing does. They scapegoat, they point fingers, and it's bad for the left wing to also engage in this type of hateful rhetoric and this type of messaging, because it just creates a lot of political deadlock. Here's where I also want to explain that anger and pessimism is extremely unsustainable because people get tired of hearing these same repetitive issues over and over and these same rhetoricized speeches from their politicians and from their party that they align themselves with. Because you get tired as a voter when you constantly hear that like the democracy is false or that the health system it has gone to complete waste and is unsavable. And this is also especially tiring because the right wing is already doing this. So like you don't want to constantly feel that politics is doomed. And in this case is where like the voters will actually disengage and we get less swing voters on their side, and we also might lose party loyalty because people are no longer wanting to hear this type of messaging. DLO's response is just that optimism equally disappoints people when things don't get better. I think this is number one, just the extremely symmetrical harm because people get tired of like negative messaging when there's no measurable change being made. But I think this is especially worse on their side where the key distinction is, which is that like when the left makes their entire platform that things are too bad or things are extremely bad, two things happen. Number one, when there's no change, they just look like complete failures. But number two, the extent of change must be much greater on their side because naturally, if you frame a really big problem, then you naturally need a really big solution to tackle this huge issue. So for example, like if the issue on their side is that the healthcare world is completely dominated by elites, then you probably need something that's able to kick all the elites out. But the very idea of hopeful messaging is that there's incremental change, where that if tomorrow the system is better than it was today, then there's incremental change and therefore the hopeful messaging and optimism is working. The barrier for the change that we actually have to make on our side is much less than the type of change you have to make when like you frame everything as being doomed, which is exactly why I think we're able to capture more voters on our side, especially the swing voters. But second of all, let's talk about better policies. I think I already explained why they create a lot of political deadlock because there's pushback from the conservative wing, which is generally bad because once again, there's more apathetic swing voters and there's more deadlock in legislature because like there's of the extreme polarization that they're causing on their side. I think the implication of this is that yes, we can wash out all the loyal voters in this debate. The left will still vote for the left, the right will still vote for the right, but there will be apathetic swing voters who hate partisan conflicts and therefore are more apathetic on their side. But I also think that if you focus so heavily on a problem, once again, no solution seems like sufficient. I also think we have to recognize that there's like a political opportunity cost on their side, which is that if blame gets you the most attention, you'll most naturally divert like your time and capital on that. And I think in politics, resources are zero sum. So if I'm a left-wing politician and I see that this type of messaging has been working especially well for me, I'm going to put all my resources, I'm going to put all my campaigning time into focusing on the problem and maybe only a little time explaining to voters what the actual solution is, which is why I don't think they can just co-opt everything on our side because the obvious political opportunity cost that still exists in a debate like this. So I think ultimately, on their side, you are no longer judged as like how effective of a politician you are. And like once you just rely on problem-based exaggerated messaging, and once it becomes dominant, there's less focus on the solutions you actually produce because you are not held to that metric as much as you are held to the metric of the number and the extent of the issues you're able to point out. Because naturally, that's where the discourse is because of how humans are wired. And for all these reasons, there's less focus on good pragmatic policies on their side for this reason proposed.
All right, thank you, Proposition 3, for that speech. Can we please have Opposition 3?
Hi, can you hear and see me?
Yes.
People are stuck in cycles of poverty. They see chaos and violence on their screens and in the streets. They are surrounded by pessimistic narratives that tell you that the political system needs a massive restructuring. The question this round was never whether or not the political outrage existed. It was which party would be able to control it. We are very proud to oppose. There's a couple of things you'll hear from me in my speech. First, on clarification to clear up the to clear up the background of this round. Secondly, on why we get more political opt-in, and thirdly, why we're able to use political outrage in more meaningful ways. On clarifications, firstly, even at this point in the round, it's still very unclear what the comparatives in this round looks like because side proposition elects to be remarkably uncharitable. We think that they want to make the comparison to be that there is a solution on one side and that the solution is possible, versus on another side, that a solution doesn't exist and is impossible. But in what world would any political candidate say the state of the world is in chaos and I, as a candidate, promise to do nothing about it? We think the more likely comparison is faith in the system versus faith without the system. On their side of the house, they would campaign the system can heal itself through natural changes by working within the system, while on our side of the house, people would say that no, the system itself is flawed and can never be changed, which is why it needs to be restructured and we need some radical form of change. That is the likely comparative in this round. They squirm in third and say, no, but on both sides of the house, we both acknowledge these same issues, but it's just that on their side of the house, they have solutions. Like, no, you definitionally do not agree on these same issues. On their side of the house, they buy into the system. They say issues may exist in the system, but the way we solve it is through the system. Whereas on our side of the house, we say you need a massive restructuring. We think on both sides of the house, you would have solutions. It's just a question of what the problem is specifically. But on problem identification, there's a lot of word gymnastics from proposition, but there's the implication at the end of this is clear. Firstly, is that discussion on the root of the issue is in fact important because it's specifically what enables proper solutions to be formed. And secondly, that form of productive discussion is only accessible on our side of the house at the point in which you actually identify the root issue or the root causes of these problems. But secondly, scapegoating and blaming certain individuals is more likely to happen on their comparative when you ignore the root structural issues that happen in society, and people are more likely to opt into things like populism or blaming minorities and immigrants and all of that on their side of the house. Secondly, what actually is the issue in status quo? I'm going to expand this later on in my questions, but this is important, given that even if they prove they get more opt-in and more buy-in on their study house, if this buy-in and this political outrage is directed towards unproductive solutions, we don't think that's necessarily good. We think, frankly, the reason as to why the same group of people face these same issues across different political parties, across different administrations, is not because there's a system that can be fixed. It's not because the specific political party in power can necessarily has the incentive to make better decisions that help everybody, but rather that there's an issue with elitist lobbying and there's a larger issue within the political system itself. We think that issue is only identified on our study house. Question one then, why we get more political opt-in? The central claim under this question was that on our study house, individuals are only likely to opt into left-wing parties when they believe that their opinions are aligned with that of the party. We think Prop concedes in first, where they say that moderate voters understand that problems exist, but don't know how to vote. But if it's true that moderate voters understand that large problems in society exist, they would only trust and opt into the left-wing party if the left also says that the issue is severe and needs a massive solution. If they say that on their study house, the problem can be organically fixed, but the problem isn't that bad, or if they say other optimistic things, like we can get this done easily, then obviously moderate voters who on both sides of the house concede are aware of the issues in society likely would not opt into left-wing parties on their study house to begin with. There are two lines of response then that we get on opt-in. Firstly, is that people are apathetic because they don't think solutions are likely. This is untrue per our comparative, per the characterization of our comparative. We told you, we're not just focusing on the issues, but also on solutions. That's inherent to both sides of the house. But the flip here is true. We think voters become more apathetic when they believe political parties to be disingenuous, when they think that the messaging of political parties contradicts their lived experiences. Both sides in this round agree that individuals view the current status quo to be dire and to be a large problem. On their study house, when political parties are continuously disingenuous, so the problem is small, we can solve this organically. When they afford optimistic narratives, that's the moment in which voters become apathetic because they don't believe that either political party actually represents their feelings. Second, a response that moderates feel discouraged. We realize then that moderates are probably the most objective voters in this round, which is why things like optimism and naively opting into corrupt institutions probably isn't going to go over very well with them, which is why I don't think that moderates are more likely to vote on their study house. What is the weighing at the end of this question? We think here we're going to weigh on the quality versus the quantity of opt-in. We think it's not true that left voters are automatically guaranteed on either side of the house. When they see that structural issues exist, when their lived experiences tell them the institutions that exist in status quo simply cannot be fixed, but your left-wing party tells you that no, the institutions are fine and we can solve these problems, obviously left voters are going to be marginalized and left voters are going to lose confidence on their study house. So it's not necessarily true that certain voters are guaranteed universally. We think then that the more important voters to preserve are specifically the left-wing voters, even at the expense of moderates. Why is this true? We think people who genuinely believe in the issue, people who are dedicated to the movement and to the left wing, are people who are most likely to donate to their candidates, most likely to protest or advocate online, most likely to participate in political discourse, are the most productive voters in this round, which is why we think it's more important that the left wing holds on to these voters as opposed to trying to appease the moderates, who likely, even if they did opt into these parties, would not be very productive within those parties anyways. We think, in general, moderates are much less disenfranchised and much less disillusioned on our our side and are more likely to opt in. But even if this isn't true, we think the fact that we protect and we preserve left-wing voters on our side of the House is independently a path to victory. Second question is then, on which side are we able to use this political outrage in productive ways? Before that, any POIs?
So I.
Go.
If your lived experience is already so bad as you described, presumably you know what the biggest issues that need to be solved are in a country or in a city. So why do you need politicians to continuously remind you of it and to point fingers?
What? Like, just because you know the issue exists doesn't mean you as a citizen can solve it. Like, I know that healthcare is corrupt. What am I going to do as a citizen to solve it? The only way we can solve issues is if politicians advocate for these issues. And you yourself concede that on your city house, both moderates and left-wing voters understand that large systemic issues exist. So the only way we can use this political outrage towards productive ways is if politicians specifically tell you that large issues exist and here's how we're going to solve them. Very odd POI. Secondly, while we use this political capital in productive ways, we have two claims here. Firstly, that we correctly identify these structural issues in political systems, and secondly, that we prevent the scapegoating of minorities and marginalized groups. There's a couple responses we hear from Prop. Firstly, that on our study house, we create unrealistic expectations and that they make governing easier on theirs. I have no idea why this is a good thing. Lowering the level of outrage and lowering the bar for governments is specifically what leads to continued systemic oppression and continued systemic abuse on their study house. The fact that citizens are no longer outraged, the fact that citizens can settle for for parties doing tokenistic actions is exactly why these structural issues exist in the first place. With the flip is true. The fact that more people are outraged, the fact that people hold their governments to a higher standard to completely reform the system means that people are more likely and that governments are more likely to opt these policies in the first place, which is why you get more systemic change across the board. But secondly, on their comparative, they tell you they blame general trends, like for example, general trends in the economy as to why people are suffering. But again, these general trends are just excuses, as both sides concede. There's a serious problem within the system, which is that no matter what party you vote for, the candidate isn't looking for you as a voter, but rather they're trying to appease the elites. That is the problem that exists on either side of the house, but only on our side are we willing to accept this. For all these reasons, on all these grounds, we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition 3, for that speech. Can we please invite Opposition reply?
All right, can you hear me and see me?
Yep, all good.
Wonderful. Proposition third speaker says, quote unquote, if you frame a really big problem, then you naturally need a really, really big solution to tackle this huge issue. This is exactly why cynical and pessimistic political messaging will not simply be problem-oriented, but also incorporate and justify a corresponding solution to the flaws of current institutions and elite capture at the top. 3 parts to this reply speech. Firstly, what will this messaging actually look like? Because even until this point in the debate, Proposition wants to debate their singular definition of what cynical and pessimistic messaging actually entails in the status quo, and then 2 parts. Firstly, on where will messaging be more effective in terms of buy-in and credibility? And then secondly, where will it be more beneficial for the broader population? Let's first talk about the nature of cynical and pessimistic messaging. Down our bench, numerous and countless times, we've given you several structural reasons why cynical and pessimistic messaging will not be internalized in a simply apathetic or directionless way. That the flip is actually true. That left-wing political candidates have no incentive to only focus on the problem and spam their political messaging to center only on the issues of the status quo. That those political candidates will likely emphasize the significance of the problem, and therefore it requires a correspondent widespread buy-in to democratic policies. This is a type of urgency messaging that will likely occur on our side of the house, where you claim that the scale of harm or injustice in the criminal justice system, in terms of education, in terms of how welfare is distributed, is so significant and entrenched institutionally at the top. Therefore, it requires a vast majority of the electorates and individuals on the ground to continue to protest, to buy in to specific radical left-wing policies. We give you examples such as Medicare for all, but also pointed to international examples, just how Chile's constitution was only able to be reformed and rewritten through referendums because of this type of cynical and pessimistic messaging. I think this establishes that in the status quo and in our comparative, cynical and pessimistic messaging will not be one where left-wing political candidates are irresponsible in terms of how exactly the solutions will be mandated. Secondly, then, on the effectiveness of cynical and pessimistic messaging, there are three important characteristics that you need to note here. Firstly, that there's less credibility among individuals experiencing hardships. And until Proposition Third Speaker, we still get no response to this analysis, that there's less opt-in on the potentiality of change, because all of the change and reforms that are likely to occur or suggested on their side of the house are smaller scale. How is it enchanting politics for an individual who is experiencing significant economic hardship to say that the current taxation system or current system of redistribution is okay? We just need to specifically remove certain politicians or make small scale changes, and the system itself is still optimistic. This type of optimism is unlikely to be relatable to the exact individuals experiencing the outcomes of the pessimism in their daily lived experiences. But secondly, that this is not just about electing certain politicians. There's broader scale buy-in for left-wing policies. What we pointed out is that structural reform is only justified by the moderates and population if people believe the existing political system is structurally flawed, not temporally flawed by current administrations or individual policy issues or politicians being incompetent. That was the response that we gave that got no response from Team China. Here is the weighing then. Even at their very, very best case, where you do buy that they get more centrist or swing voters, we proved down our bench in second and third why appealing to left-wing voter base or left-leaning moderates is far more important, because these are the most devoted individuals that are likely to consistently show up in referendums, consistently show up in local elections, consistently turn out in mid-party elections as well. Now on to the implications of this messaging. They give you zero response towards our argumentation on why cynical messaging ensures that the anger of individuals is rallied towards the correct sources of injustice. It is not captured by reactionary, extremely radical conservative movements to point the issues of immigrants, to point the issues of individuals at the bottom of our institutions. That type of redirection is what is required in our status quo, but we also pointed out why we get far more transformative politics and broader scale changes, even if they take longer and may not be perfect on our side of the house. So when these policies do get passed after messaging, it is far more likely to benefit the quality of life of people to a far greater and tangible degree. On all of these grounds, clear Team Korea win.
Thank you. Opposition reply. Can we please have proposition reply?
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Panel, this debate is really messy because both sides acknowledge that people can tell that institutions are corrupt and that many issues are not dealt with well. The disagreement occurs on how both sides frame what voters then need from politicians, given that they have a baseline understanding of issues in politics. Let's settle this deadlock and tackle the op case. Firstly, op's point is just a misread of what optimism means in this debate. If we prioritize optimistic messaging, we're not ignoring hardship at all. We're explicitly acknowledging it because you cannot talk about solutions unless you first recognize that there is a real problem to solve. The difference then is that we frame those hardships in a way that keeps political agency alive, in a way that says the system may be flawed now, but still capable of being changed through democratic action. Op says the system was always built to favor the elites and it's impossible to change, which makes voters much, much more helpless. Secondly, as pointed from first, many voters already acknowledge that the problems exist in society are not genuine problems. They don't vote because they think neither party focuses on solving these problems at the very beginning. They only need evidence that someone has a credible plan to improve these conditions, and populism gives them this evidence. Third, I want to know how there is a huge concession from third speaker's POI. They said that people need politicians to remind them of solutions, and because only politicians have the capacity. I want to remind you what Emma said about opposition stands. She told you that they cannot simultaneously claim that we'll talk about how the system is so corrupt and then say solutions possible. Because if you tell the people that the system is captured by elites and the wealth, they won't believe change is possible because they believe all possible reforms can be overthrown by the class that holds disproportionate take power. Comparatively, we can simultaneously claim that we will have the diagnosis of problems under our side of the house. It's just well focused way more on providing these solutions. I want to talk about our case then. I want to first weigh making the political system more productive over transforming society by acknowledging these systematic issues. I want you to weigh this on two aspects. Firstly, on likelihood. This is important because A, if it is not likely, they have no access to their impacts. But B, politics is a zero-sum game. Resources should be diverted to the things that have the highest success rate. They lose on likelihood because it is very unlikely that left-wing politicians can be able to change the huge systematic issues that as they state, e.g. corruption or corporate capture, etc. We have high likelihood because advocating for specific solutions, i.e. not trying to solve a huge problem at once, is a proven historical method of political evolution, e.g. closing revolving door loopholes between Congress and K Street. At worst, at least some change is made on our side of the house, and this takes them at their very best. Secondly, on risk, they have a high risk of failure because, as we have told you from second, that these systematic issues are extremely hard to change. This leads to massive distrust of left-wing politicians. This makes the world have even less progressive change. We have low risk of failure under our side of the house because the politics and the politicians suggest are oftentimes much more achievable. So voters can see actual change happening on a much more marginal scale compared to their side of the house. Also better for the entire political landscape because there's less deadlock, and thus people would participate in the political system even more, e.g. increasing voter turnout. On their side of the house, as we told you in our second speech, it is extremely likely, for example, for voters to lose trust in the government once they have very high expectations upon the system to change very effectively and to change very hugely. And thus, when you see a lack of change happening at that point, to that extent, people stop engaging, and that is when you open the loophole to have, for example, even more corporate lobby, and for the corporate lobby to take on even more power. But lastly, we push to how this sways moderates and swing voters, and note that their reputations are insufficient because the premise of their case is that voters want someone to recognize their problems. The premise to our argument is that average voters can see the visible problem in society, i.e. healthcare being too expensive, but what gets them to vote is who brings them concessions and who brings them hope. And under our side of the house, it is our side of the house that brings the concessions and brings them hope and gives them the ability to trust the government and to be able to vote for them. At the end of the day, we take the debate on two aspects. Firstly, we take them at their very best. Even if, for example, you are able, for example, to bring a lot of bigger change, it is very, very unlikely for you to bring that change in the very first place. Secondly, we told you how we're able to swing moderate voters and swing voters and bring more voter turnout in the end. Thus, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Proposition, for that reply. Thank you, Proposition and Opposition, for what was a very fun debate. I think you're supposed to stay in this room. Me and the panelists will go into the op room to deliberate now. Thank you very much. You're invited to cross the floor now.
Thanks for the round.
Thank you.
Yeah, also the teams,
you.
please stay here. The team will be announced here.